Thank you, Carol. It's such a pleasure to be here at the Skyscraper Museum talking about charity and children and women and about all the kinds of work that was done to counter the effects of the big capitalists you love to study on the landscape. But I would say that Carol and I, we are great friends, and we have been friends and colleagues for a long time, and we have shared this project of inventing a new way to think about architecture and to think about architecture history from the point of view of building and practice and engagement, finance, economy, law, all this stuff. And so I do say we have a shared project. We just look at different scales and different cities. And also, it was in that reading group, which met in Carol's house in her apartment, which she generously hosted for, I don't know, about a year or two, and that I read the book that sent me back to graduate school, and that was William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis. It was the thinking in that book that made me think to myself, oh, I really do need to learn about how to do this. And that is anyway, so here we are. Thank you all for coming on a rainy night and one with a chill in the air. So, okay, Elizabeth, thank you. So we're going to start here on a sunny morning in 1895. When this photograph of the West Oakland Free Kindergarten was made. And by the way, I am reading to my students. You never see me read, but I do have to read in this context because, or my former students, I should say, I have to read in this context because otherwise we'll be here all night. Okay, so when this photograph of the West Oakland Free Kindergarten was made, I've selected this place because it's one of the sites that introduced me to the charitable landscape of Oakland. And by charitable landscape, I mean the physical network of spaces that women put together to improve American cities for children. So this evening, I'd like to explain how I came to study the charitable landscape and share some of the strategies that I used to excavate the history of the buildings that made it up. If urban history starts by asking questions and theorizing thesis-driven arguments, then the answers depend on finding evidence. And it's hard to come by for a building like this one that was not designed by an architect, that was never drawn, and not often photographed. This is one of the 3 photographs that I've uncovered, and that had a short life. So along the way, I'll share some of the images that didn't make it into my new book, A City for Children, Women, Architecture, and the Charitable Landscape of Oakland. So here's the first one, this bird's eye view of Oakland. Now, the settings of the charitable landscape are invisible in a view like this one, even though the female investments in childhood help to make cities a place for hope about the future, like Carol's Skyscrapers, rather than only despair about poverty and injustice in the present. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Bay Area, this view will help you understand the geography of the region. And so we are looking from Oakland across the bay towards San Francisco with the Golden Gate in the distance. The Golden Gate in this view, which is from 1900, does not yet have the famous bridge that bears the same name, Golden Gate. And what you see here is the Great Pier that juts out into the Great Railroad Pier that juts out into the bay, and that will figure in this story. What I show you in the detail is a blow-up of the community that I've spent some time studying, Oakland Point, the community that sprang into life when the railroad pier was built in conjunction with the arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad. It is here, and it is where the West Oakland Free Kindergarten was located. Okay, I am already out of space. Can I have a chair? Thank you. Great. This is additive and incremental, right? Just like my book. Okay, so sadly, almost the entire charitable landscape was lost through urban redevelopment and slum clearance programs. In West Oakland, the Free Kindergarten was torn down in the 1920s to make way for this public playground, the first one in the neighborhood. In 1960, a demolition contractor driving a Sherman Army tank destroyed the playground when he cleared 12 acres of land and driving a tank, cleared 12 acres of land. That's where the Free Kindergarten was located, the big red arrow, to make way for this enormous sorting facility for the U.S. Post Office. 1,000 families were displaced and 300 houses were demolished despite widespread opposition in what has become a largely African American community. And for those of you who know the Bay Area, this photograph was taken from the West Oakland BART station. Next. So one reason that historians study West Oakland is because this is where Bobby Seale and Huey Newton organized the Black Panther Party, outraged by the kinds of projects I just showed you. And 1048 Peralta Street is one of the buildings in which the Black Panthers met, just up the street from the site of the West Oakland Free Kindergarten. Okay, next. So I came to study this community for other reasons. With so many sites cleared, the largely erased charitable landscape became apparent to me through a series of fortuitous and not so fortuitous events. After the Cypress Freeway collapsed during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, and some of you may remember that event, next, the California State Department of Transportation agreed to move the freeway to a new location. I was invited to join the study team that Caltrans formed to document the area, and I'll just show you, to document the area, the Cypress Freeway was located here. The moving of the freeway required a large historical archaeological project because every site that was covered by the new freeway had to be dug in order to ensure that there were no prehistoric, not historic, remains. What kills highway projects in California is the uncovering of protected artifacts. So while working under the auspices of the Anthropological Studies Center at Sonoma State, I learned that women repurposed buildings to make public architecture for children. Now, this method of making urban institutions tied into my abiding interest in investigating how, in different historical circumstances, men, women, and children harness opportunities in the built environment to make better lives for themselves and their fellow citizens. Next. So this tied into what I had practiced as a young architect in New York City when I learned to repurpose buildings to make shelters for homeless and abused women and children. And this is one of the projects I worked on as a young architect, the Casa Rita shelter for women and children, for homeless women and kids, which was opened in the Bronx in the mid-1980s. This project was done in Conrad Levinson's office, and it won an Arnold Bruner Award, a Rudy Bruner Award for Urban Excellence from the New York chapter of the AIA. I also went on to explore these ideas in the first book I worked in, Reweaving the Urban Fabric, which was written with colleagues at Columbia, and the New York State Council on the Arts. Okay, so then I came to Berkeley, and I was all set to write a dissertation on homelessness in New York City in the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, including children. And I show you some of the buildings that I intended to include. The Newsboys Lodging Houses being one of the many Newsboys Lodging Houses which the Children's Aid Society opened around New York, in Manhattan for the most part, and these photographs were taken by Jacob Reese. Okay, so I had one chapter written, and 2 weeks before my qualifying exams, I was invited to join the Cypress Freeway Replacement Project. And in short order, the dissertation that I had envisioned as lodging vagrancy became On the Ground in Oakland, Women in Institution Building in an Industrial City. In the humanities, one doesn't turn down funding for research ever. Okay, so again, like our city builders. So next. So this led to other work, Modern Childhoods, which was developed during a postdoc at Berkeley. And this is an interdisciplinary collection of essays that Ningda Connick-Smith and I developed to argue that the material worlds created for and by children across the globe are central to construction of modernity, historically and in the present day. And to date, it is still the only book that deals with this subject from an international and interdisciplinary perspective, which is really quite interesting. Okay, so next. So now, kids have always lived, played, learned, and worked in urban spaces. However, the provision of places purposefully made for them is an invention of the modern world. And in Centuries of Childhood, Philippe Ariès alerted historians to this physical differentiation of the desire to separate the worlds of adults and children. And he argued that a new understanding of childhood emerged in early modern Europe when the privileged, when the privileged classes embraced a sentimental ideal emphasizing a child's innocence. And spaces and objects started to change as adults used them to set out and put in place their goals for childhood. Now, there are many criticisms of Ariès, but his insights that materiality matters in the history of childhood and that childhood must be historicized helped to create an entirely new field of study, the architectural history of modern childhood. And I show you some of the texts that have contributed to the development of this field. Almost all of them have been published in the past 10 years. So in my book, I show how women claim spaces for working class children as they open charities for them in Northern California. And I show how the power produced through these places shaped children, childhood, and the liberal conviction that children are social subjects with citizenship rights that depend on physical spaces that are purposefully made for young people. Now, this is something we take for granted now, but in 1850 and in 1860, it was not taken for granted at all, that children were social subjects with citizenship rights that depend on physical places. So take the kindergarten, for example. Great, okay. So just after she graduated from college, Elizabeth Betts decided to open the charity school in Oakland Point, the racially integrated multi-ethnic community that abutted the Southern Pacific's sprawling railroad yards. Into this miserable, neglected region of Oakland, an admirer subsequently wrote, they always exaggerate, right? A teacher fearlessly took her way in the summer of 1886 to beckon the children before it should be too late to influence their lives. A free kindergarten numbering 30 children was opened in a little wooden building, the former premises of a liquor saloon, and that's the building you see in the background. Now, not surprisingly, the author, a Berkeley reformer named Harlan, underscored the import of the decision to repurpose this ordinary building near the heart of the industrial machine. By turning a saloon into a school, kindergartening to reform movements that women in the U.S. used to win a foothold in public culture and other cities on behalf of children in the 1880s and 1890s. And so as you see in this photograph, supervised by 3 teachers and gathered to learn through play, these kids were protected from the danger, disease, crime, and immorality that kindergarten teachers believed were legion in immigrant neighborhoods like this one. And if you look closely, you'll also see that the nonsectarian charity was racially integrated 1 year before the Supreme Court declared separate was equal in the United States. So Betts is one example of how, and I unfortunately do not have a photograph of her, never found, but okay. So Betts is one example of how in a standard mixed economy of social welfare prevailed historically in the United States. The government counted on women to care for children in need, and women from the largest state in the urbanizing West were more than eager to oblige. By 1870, California was the 7th most urbanized state in the United States. We think of California not in those terms at all, but in fact it was highly urbanized. So they formed voluntary associations, society that Americans from all walks of life used to expand state power, including to protect children. And white Protestant women joined Irish Catholic, middle-class American club women to open charities for an equally diverse group of children. Often without the financial means to build from scratch, women did not conceive of urban land as a blank slate to be wiped clean for profit-driven development. Instead, they used and reused everyday buildings for charities, turning to middle class church basements, working class cottages, and even the saloon we're going to look at in more detail this evening. They gave them placed on working families in an indifferent industrial capitalist economy. Okay, so now the trajectory of the book follows. So women started in San Francisco, where there was an urgent need to organize public assistance for homeless children after California joined the Union in 1850. They opened Protestant and Catholic orphanages for dependent children, first in everyday houses, and quickly raised the funds to erect the masonry buildings that you see here. Next. So the San Francisco City Council did some work on its own. It took some initiative. It erected an industrial school for delinquent children. And Bob Durkin, who's on your left, was the first child to be moved from the municipal jail to this building, which was modeled on the New York State House of Refuge. Durkin did not abandon his life of crime, all hopes to the contrary, and he's shown as an adult criminal on the right, and these photographs are courtesy of the San Francisco Rogues Gallery, which was the first Rogues Gallery, a police gazette of photographs to be created in the United States. So half of this building was built. This half was built. This half was built. This wing was never constructed. And these are cell banks inside of here. There was steel or cast iron frame, which was inserted inside the masonry structure, and the cells were 5 by 7. Again, side by 7 feet, and intended for one child, and quickly, of course, more than that. That number existed. It was a horrible place. Okay, so next. So this is begins in San Francisco, and we come to Oakland, where women started to open charities after the Transcontinental Railroad arrived in 1869, and a town of about 10,000 people, which was platted in 1850, began to grow. And so I show you a map of the region, both of the region and of Oakland in particular, outlining the track of the railroad, right? The railroad which comes through West Oakland ends up on that great pier and divides both into passenger and freight lines. The railroad ended here. Just one side story, I promise I won't get too digress too much, but one of the only time the United States Congress said no to the railroads was when, as the Transcontinental Railroad was being planned during the Civil War, the proposal was tendered to fill in all of this area of the bay between here and Angel Island, not Angel Island, that island. Gene, what's the name of that island? I'm sorry? Yeah, Yerba Buena Island. Thank you. Yerba Buena Island, to fill it in with earth so that the railroad could get even closer to its terminus, which was the bay. The U.S. Senate said no. Okay, so next. In the 1870s and 1880s, this is women in Oakland setting them up in ordinary houses and replacing them with purpose-built institutions as the means became available. And this map is a map which took quite some effort to make. It's a map that traces the development of the charitable landscape, starting with the first orphanage, moving to the second, then the third, and then adding the other sites that came clear. It's very hard to read the numbers from a distance, so I'm trying these red circles to see if they help make the pattern more legible. Now, since procuring low-cost spaces in standing buildings facilitated innovation, I argue that this method of building institutions for children is an example of the point made by Jane Jacobs throughout the death and life of great American cities, that new places and ideas come from experimenting with older things and practices, and the practice of repurposing is not only an evidence of adult parsimony, but actually, with regard to children, but actually evidence of creative thinking. And so if I could have the next, if we look at the West Oakland home, a building that started out in the cottage that you saw in color on the previous slide, and was moved to West Oakland thanks to a big gift from the Crocker family, whom the founder of this charity was friendly with, Rebecca McQuaid, purchased this building, an old house, put the orphanage in the house, and then after the Crocker gift came through, on adjacent property, built a handsome new addition, a dormitory addition, designed by William Kirk. And if you look closely at the photo, which you can't from where you are, but if you do, I can promise you that you'll see that this charity, at this stage in its history, was as racially integrated as the kindergarten that I showed you earlier, and that was just down the street from it. By repurposing houses and adding purpose-built additions, I argue that women render public a private building. Next, please. If we also think about the siting, what you can't tell from this photograph is that directly across the street is a public school, the Prescott School, later known as the Melting Pot School, the school where Huey Newton and many others went to school, not this building, but its successor institution. But nonetheless, the siting was strategic, I argue, in order locating charities in places that would, by virtue of geography, augment community life, and that also forged the creation of institutional ties, so that the kids from this orphanage went to public school in that building, and the children in the neighborhood who needed to come to kindergarten would come to the free kindergarten that was located within the orphanage. I'm not sure where in the building, but nonetheless there. So this was this marrying of purpose and purpose through place. Okay, so next, the women will expand the charitable landscape to include free kindergartens, settlement houses, playgrounds, and vacation schools. This is the flowering of public culture, both for women and for children in the beginning of the progressive era, and one in which I in the book talk about how the right to childhood becomes very closely tied with the right to play in purpose-made settings, not on back lots full of stagnant ponds of water, but on playgrounds that are, in this case, located next to public schools. And then next. As the progressive era unfolds, women deliver the interests of children directly to the heart of government as aspirations for children and childhood change. They improve orphanages. They lobby for new state regulations. Next, please. And they also build day nurseries for working class mothers. The first day nurseries in California start in the basements of orphanages, and then they expand into become independent, separate structures. Next, please. So not all problems were resolved. We look at this in great admiration, at least I do, but I think it's important to recognize that as America urbanized, the charitable landscape rendered public the architectural decisions of women and the social needs of children. It also inscribed the physical reminders of the failures that demanded its creation. Some charities were racially segregated. Some charities that were integrated became segregated. Children didn't benefit equally from adult largesse. And the physical spaces in the charitable landscape worked to ingrain inequalities as well as to endow children with an idealized world. So a central thesis is that the physical spaces are not a backdrop for childhood. Rather, the two, space and childhood, are mutually constitutive. We no longer suppose a child to be the empty slate proposed by John Locke, a vessel that a parent or teacher fills up with social norms and cultural ideals, and similarly to consider a building or a place in isolation strips it of its significance. And in this I follow the thinking of the political philosopher Henri Lefebvre, who has argued that for any person, including a child, there's a dynamic rather than a static relationship between a physical place, its social makeup, and childhood as an ideal or imagined condition. And so I show you here examples of photos of the different charities and the changing racial composition of them over time. And this charitable landscape becomes increasingly segregated as the 20th century unfolds. Okay, so let's look at the free kindergarten now, so we can take a closer look at it. So we can begin to look at this in relationship to one of the central examples of the book. So just after she graduated from this institution, the California Kindergarten Training School in San Francisco, Elizabeth Betts decided to open the free kindergarten in a West Oakland saloon. She learned from Kate Wiggin and Nora Smith, shown here on the screen, and her teachers at the training school to count on material culture to implement her goals for children. Asserting that all children had the right to childhood, they argued that working class children should learn through play in a special school with special toys. They also expected to socialize children in middle class values. Architecture mattered, and for more than one reason. Almost always, women made a free kindergarten into a physical wedge, the first imprint of a multi-purpose reform complex that they used to expand their public culture as well as to educate children. So we'll come back to this building, but let's just, transcontinental, their solutions depended on transcontinental and transnational connections between reform circles. For kindergarten, ties stretched south to Carolyn Severin's, the great reformer who moved from Boston to Los Angeles, east across the continent to Elizabeth Peabody in Boston, also a great reformer, and even further east across the Atlantic Ocean to Emma Marwedel in Germany. Peabody convinced Marwedel, a student of Friedrich Froebel, to move to the US, where she taught Wigan at Severin's training school in Los Angeles. And so I show you the people involved in this constellation displayed on the map. And Wigan herself was a product of migration. She grew up in the East Coast and moved to the West Coast to Los Angeles, in part because of family crisis, and she ended up at Severin's training school. So from her teachers, Wigan learned to argue that motherhood should be conscious and that all children, including other people's children, had a right to childhood and thus to a kindergarten education. Rich or poor, male or female, Protestant or not, learning began with exactly the same gift, a soft, brightly colored yarn ball that dangled from a string and represented the self in unity. And you see an example on the left. The 19 gifts that followed engaged the sense of touch, sight, sound, and smell, made movement and mathematics part of the school day, and challenged imagination and creativity. Children also explored nature in the German kindergartens, and the site plan is a plan of Froebel's kindergarten in Germany, a goal in sync with the romantic ideal of childhood as innocent, natural, and free. Froebel assigned garden plots to kids where they grew flowers and vegetables and distributed the surplus to the needy. Next. So Wigan carried these beliefs to San Francisco, and she came in 1878 in the middle of a devastating crisis that inspired the liberal elite to take this step to mitigate class conflict. They organized the Public Kindergarten Society, the first in California, or in San Francisco, which at Weddell's suggestion hired Wigan to set up the first free kindergarten west of the Rocky Mountains. The neighborhood choice, Tar Flat, he worked in this neighborhood, which is circled in the map on the right, that was becoming the center for heavy industry and shipping on the West Coast. In a year or two, Nora Smith joined her sister as co-teachers. So we see Tar Flat right here, and then the site within Tar Flat where the kindergarten was located. Now, since the Public Kindergarten Society could not afford to construct a new building with an expansive garden, it rented 2 rooms in a school on Silver Street, which, as I just said, is circled on the map. So to come back to the school. So this building had been erected for the California Collegiate Institute for Young Ladies in 1861, when Tar Flat was called Happy Valley. It was a completely different kind of people living there. And it later became an annex to an overcrowded grammar school. With 4 classrooms stretched across the front, 3 floors, many windows, including 2 generous bays and fenced yards, there was plenty of room in the wood frame building for the school to grow. And if you look at this photograph, it's really quite extraordinary. Kids are all over the place. There are kids on the stairs, there are kids in the windows, there are kids hanging out on the porch. This was obviously a photograph that was taken to document the great success of this reform institution in the midst of this industrial community, industrializing community. There are also 3 signs which are hard to read from where you are, but they say the Silver Street Kindergartens, the California Kindergarten Training School, because there was both a kindergarten and a training school that worked together, and also a boys' free reading room. That sign is down here, and there's a separate entrance for that library that comes through that fence. You can also see that the served and service spaces of the school are separated from one another. This great board fence here, which is actually covered with graffiti, masks the service yard, and the picket fence opens the building to the community. Now this building too is long gone, cleared in the 1930s to make way for the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. So, wanting the place to implement her goals for children, Wigan made the 2 rooms that she rented and attractive and friendly to children, and intentionally different than a public school classroom, where the furnishings literally fixed children in place. And we don't have a photo of the interior of Silver Street, but this photo of a free kindergarten in New York will stand in just well. This is a photograph of a California public school classroom, and this is a drawing that illustrated Wiggins' book, one of the books she wrote, which is the story called The Story of Patsy, and that person there is more or less. Okay, so whether in a rented space, a repurposed building, or a purpose-made setting, women counted on architecture to create new forms of identity for children. Kids found movable red tables inscribed with patterns to guide foible games, and matching chairs with red cushions, plants, a canary, a fishbowl, pictures, a piano, and closets full of toys. There were no books. There were no mathematical games. Children came here to learn through play. In line with Froebel's thinking, and the geometrical arrangement of choice, a circle to express the unity of children, was also in accordance with Froebel's metaphysical theories. And you can see the circle that in which children are organized in the photo on the lower photo here. So, believing children to be malleable, Wiggin imported a middle-class model for childhood to the tar-flat classroom. Her hope was to educate and socialize children by offering a new world full of astonishing sensory experiences that were different from those found at homes or on the streets outside the school. Inspiration to cleanliness and courtesy by furnishing an atmosphere of beauty and shining neatness everywhere was my thought, she wrote. No shouts, no nasty smells, no dirt, no disorderly street play, no garbage. Rather, clean boys and girls would listen to music, experiment with sand, water, and colorful toys. She also insisted that the charity be non-sectarian and it be racially integrated, and she welcomed African American and Asian American children to the school, and this is, of course, in 1878, as the pressure is mounting for what will become the first official immigration act in this nation's history, the Chinese Exclusion Acts, passed by the U.S. Congress in 1882 and directed completely at California. Okay, so next. So, and after Nora Smith joined her sister, the two women rented more rooms to make place for the training school and community functions. And the caption on the back of the photo, it's always important to turn photographs over, announces that Kate Douglas Wiggin and her sister Nora Archibald Smith taught kindergarten here and kindergarten training, and identifies the other rooms in the building, which were all named after notable reformers. Wiggin and Smith also deliberately and ambitiously formed a network of women supporters, and joined by another kindergarten activist named Sarah B. Cooper, they made the Bay Area into a center of the free kindergarten movement in the United States. They published pamphlets to promote their work and recorded their accomplishments in scrapbooks. And this was a project taken on by Smith after Wiggin went on to do other things. And all 5 of the volumes are in the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley, and they're full of pamphlets and other kinds of records like this one. This is basically a form of book publishing, making scrapbooks. By 1893, there were 40 kindergarten classes offered in this city, attended by 3,588 children, and hundreds of women had graduated from this and other training schools. Elizabeth Betts was among them, as were Winnie McFarland and Jenny Wheaton, who shared, and their shared career trajectory brought them to the free kindergarten that Betts opened in Oakland Point right after she finished school. Okay, so next. So she started by renting a room in the building on Peralta Street, and so I repeat the photograph, the map showing a site plan or area plan showing where the kindergarten was located, right up the street from the railroad yards, and then every other building that's shaded here is a saloon. So in a neighborhood full of saloons, this structure had been used as one, according to women who were sympathetic to Betts's project. Just 16 years ago, she opened a free kindergarten in an old building that used to be a saloon, one wrote in the San Francisco Call. She didn't look for an elaborate house and a location where she would be surrounded by her friends. No, not she. Instead, she went to the quarters of the poorest of Oakland's poor. And the form and location of the building on a prominent corner that faced an entry to the railroad yards suggests the claim is accurate. Next, please. So for comparison, have a look at this saloon and lodging house, which is just up the street on Peralta Street, and one that's a building that still stands from the period. And James Davidson built it in 1888, 1 block north of the kindergarten site. And the Scottish immigrant, a carpenter, who also called himself a capitalist, built 4 other buildings on the corner of Peralta and 5th Street, and that site plan documents the extent of his construction. And he also worked as a barkeep in his saloon. So to begin with, Betts made no major changes to the rented room as much as her teachers insisted a child should find a new world of sight, sound, and experience in a kindergarten. She had trouble covering expenses, to say nothing of paying for alterations, so she took advantage of other resources at her disposal, most importantly, the power to name. And in Betts's case, the linguistic change from saloon to school intensified the clout of her intervention, one that catapulted the building from one gender culture into another. Next, please. So by the 1880s, saloons had become fixtures in the daily lives of men in working class neighborhoods, off limits to respectable women. Working men came to stylish bar rooms to eat and drink and socialize, and a barkeep, almost always male, stood behind a long, polished hardwood counter to serve a working man who expected to stand up to drink. And typically, the interior was embellished with features symbolic of and important to manly culture: bottles displayed behind the bar, a mirror reflecting gaslight, briny, shiny brass handrails, footrails, and cuspidors, and sawdust on the floor. Now, saloons were not off limits to children, and this intergenerational use, which was infuriating to kindergartners and temperance women alike, shows us that the worlds of children and adults were not yet segregated in working class neighborhoods in the 1880s and 90s. And parents sent children to saloons to buy a growler, a bucket of beer, and some of you know that term, I'm sure. Newsboys entered to sell newspapers, and adolescent boys sauntered in, eager to learn how adult men conducted themselves. In Jack London's memoirs, Jack London grew up in this part of Oakland, and his memoirs are quite telling on that count. Also quite telling of the subsequent alcoholism, but in any event. Children also came to find absent fathers and bring them home, albeit to childhoods that reformers argued had been sullied by parental affection for alcohol. Next. So under the dynamic leadership of Frances Willard, the Women's Christian Temperance Union capitalized on this theme, the vulnerability of children and childhood to alcohol. Willard included Oakland in her 1883 temperance campaign in California. She stopped. Thousands of people greeted her, and her expectation that women would do everything for temperance had an enormous impact on the charitable landscape for children in California, ranging from drinking fountains like these to organizing campaigns to temperance education in public schools and opening temperance kindergartens. Willard hailed the kindergarten movement, calling it the greatest theme next to salvation by faith that can engage a woman's heart and brain. So next. So Betts didn't belong to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but I argue that his activism shaped her decision to use the saloon as a tool for temperance, if not also for temperance education. And by the fall of 1886, 30 children had enrolled, coming to a place that at least some had visited in its former state. Rather than picking up jugs of beer in a dark room filled with cigar smoke, boys and girls sang songs and played games in a place filled with sunlight and toys. Day by day, a colleague wrote in the San Francisco Call, Miss Lizzie watched the little minds expand and grow, and she tried to instill in them those teachings that remain with one the whole life long. As Wiggin did in Tar Flat, Betts visited families in the neighborhood. Kindergarten teachers modeled their practice after the practice of friendly visiting to build support for her charity, and enrollment rapidly increased. Working class families needed services on offer. Community gain was shaped in class-conscious terms. Parents acted as if they were willing to negotiate the rules, rather than construe the intervention as a win or lose proposition. This is a point, for instance, made in other studies of charities and reform activity in this neighborhood, most importantly, Roy Rosenzweig in his great book, 8 Hours for What We Will. So as the number of students grew, women tied to the temperance movement organized the West Oakland Free Kindergarten Association to help meet expenses. A larger building and better facilities for carrying on the work are much needed, the Oakland Enquirer insisted in 1892, and even before the economic crisis hit the next year, students had been refused due to lack of room, and irregular funding had made it difficult to meet expenses. Afterward, after the Depression of 1893 hit, talk of expansion came to a halt, but only for a time being. Next, please. So the economic depression, which began in 1893 and intensified in 1894 and continued until 1898, left 25% unemployed in American cities. And I think it is now, most historians agree that this was the worst depression to hit the U.S., certainly equal to the Great Depression of the 1930s, if not exceeding it. It's just the lack of data that makes it difficult to state that absolutely definitively. But in any event, the impact is immediate on charities. Every institution supported by the public has keenly felt the stringency of the times, the Enquirer reported, as pledges to charities were canceled one by one. So in this period of discontent, of great discontent, organized women looked for new paradigms. And in retrospect, it's clear that this time of intensified class conflict sparked a change in political vision that was crucial to shaping the reform discourse that flowered among women in the progressive era, and nowhere more than in California. When Jane Addams came to the Bay Area in January 1894, she addressed overflow crowds at the University of California at Berkeley and the First Congregational Church in Oakland. And Addams' accomplishments, the Enquirer noted, included opening a kindergarten in order to widen the child's life and give back to infancy its birthright. So next, please. Anyway, Addams, Hull House, the kindergarten at Hull House. Conversations followed Addams' visit, including with Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who had settled in Oakland, and they set the stage for the Women's Congress, organized by the Pacific Coast Women's Press Association in April 1894. Delegates spoke about the sacred right of all children to childhood and to a kindergarten education. And then 2 months later, the great strike against the Pullman Palace Car Company strained its social relationships to the breaking point. And again, I refer you to Jack London's memoirs for description of it. And federal marshals repressed the strike in Oakland Point with the same brutal force exercised in the rest of the country. And the memoir that I'm referring to is Valley of the Moon. So the Women's Congress meets, kindergarten is embraced, the strike happens next, and in the midst of this turmoil, the West Oakland Free Kindergarten Association decided to take action, led by its new patron, Elizabeth Dewey Layton Watt, who is the woman sitting in the center of the photograph. Very wealthy and equally strong-minded, Watt knew and respected Addams and attended sessions of the Women's Congress. And when she came to the West Oakland Free Kindergarten as president, or was elected its president, she decided to expand the school's programs. Betts had resigned due to her upcoming marriage, and Watt hired Winnie McFarland, another KTS graduate, to run the kindergarten, and it is McFarland who we see in the older woman we see in the photograph that I've showed you now a couple of times. And Watt also endorsed in principle and with cash the decision to launch new programs, and this sewing school was one of them. Now, Watt is a whole other figure. She's one of the heroes of the story. She was born in New Hampshire in 1844. She came to San Francisco in 1858 and married a man named Robert Watt in 1863, who was a Scottish engineer, one of the miners, the engineer/miners/investors who named Grass Valley after his home place. And he served in the Haight administration and had ambitions to be governor. So Watt was extremely rich. So in her memoir, Watt credits Betts with the idea for the sewing school, saying that the idea had come to the kindergarten teacher as a solution to domestic violence. Upper-class women responding viscerally to child abuse formed charities for child protection starting in the 1870s, and by the end of the century, the sense that all people deserved freedom from intentionally produced pain, including children, again a new idea, fed the belief that physical abuse denied the right to childhood. To fight cruelty, women in Oakland turned to a sewing school rather than the law, and it occurred to Betts that a sewing school could offer a refuge from abuse as well as a place to learn a useful skill. And remember that in a working class community at this moment, to be a seamstress was to be have one of the best jobs possible for a woman. Now, this wasn't a radical proposition for a charity. Women had integrated sewing instruction into charity starting in the Renaissance, and the managers backed Betts's proposal. And the room was soon full to overflowing. And if you see in this photograph, girls are holding cards, and this was the introductory class for cards that they used to practice stitching on. So next, please. So to begin with, then photo number 2 of this kindergarten, the sewing school met in the kindergarten and perhaps in this room where most vestiges of the saloon had been erased. In 1894, thanks to Watt's support, the charity turned its rented rooms into light-filled feminized spaces. Students looked at sentimental portraits of idealized children, emphasizing innocence, pictures of birds in flight, and a reproduction of a pre-Raphaelite painting with a Madonna-like figure in the center. Images of the Madonna were common in free kindergartens because they called attention to the ideal of motherhood and the importance of home and family. Now, the transnational network used to set up free kindergartens in California in the 1870s reappeared as a structuring force in the charitable landscape at the end of the 19th century. And this time, the international ties became clear through the embrace of design reform ideologies that included the arts and crafts movement, avidly embraced by women in the Bay Area. Gilman, for instance, endorsed the arts and crafts style at the second meeting of the Women's Congress, where she spoke in favor of simplifying home decoration as a feminist tactic leading to what we would now call women's liberation. Now, this impact on the design of the classrooms at the free kindergarten, but only up to a point. For all of her enthusiasm for the kindergarten and the sewing school, Watt didn't invest a whole lot of money in it, in the renovation, and during the Depression, frugality seems to have been as important as emphasizing art, craft, and femininity in design. And I dissect this photograph in some detail in the text, but if just one indication of frugality, right, if you look at the edge of this here, this surface here, this is probably a linoleum floor covering, and look how ragged it is, right? There was not a whole new covering of floor put in here. The wainscoting that surrounds the back of the building of the room is likely the wainscoting that was there before, and the kinds of wallpaper that is used are not particularly radical at this point in time. And I'm looking. This woman here, I believe, is Winnie McFarland, because she shows up in many photographs that continue on, in several photographs that come later in the 20th century. So did children find a new world of light and sound, a place that expressed their right to childhood? Whether photographed outside or inside the school building, children aren't gathered in a circle, the spatial analog of Freudian idealism, but they are shown in unity, not segregated by race, sex, or ethnicity. And in that sense, they record the effect of egalitarian, if not democratic, principles in action on the ground in West Oakland. And the pedagogical focus on play is also emphasized by showing toys as well as the small tables at which they are at play with Freudian blocks. But the use of this place and these children as a wedge, as a stepping stone into working class daily life, also made manifest. Scrubbed clean, neatly coiffed, and well-dressed, children's bodies display the ambition and the success of the reform program. They are without ripped coats, dirty faces, or any other indicator of the defective domesticity that troubled critics of free kindergartens in Oakland, of church-run free kindergartens in Oakland a decade earlier. And graphic symbols on the calendar, drawn in chalk on the blackboard, make explicit the activities of each day of the week. They are the ones that direct children to class-specific futures. In this republic of childhood, children are told when and how to behave. A church is shown on Sunday. a spigot, sink, and bucket on Tuesday, thread, scissors, and cloth on Wednesday, tea service and setting on Thursday, dustpan and broom on Friday, and a rolling pin and dough on Saturday. Implicitly, the lessons that would happen within the school Monday is not assigned. Now, this dual message isn't surprising because kindergartens carry two models for childhood to this neighborhood and use them to choreograph play at the school. The middle class may have accepted the social construction of the economically worthless child in the 1890s, but the situation remained fluid for other children, even as elites tried to reorganize their time toward education and recreation and away from wage labor. Because of this circumstance, this condition of flux, Betts and McFarland embraced the sentimental value of children as they taught habits of mind, hand, and eye that prepared boys and girls for manual labor and industrial work. On the one hand, the kindergarten made palpable middle-class culture and suggested children could become emotional assets to parents. As one reformer wrote, the value placed on the children by the kindergartens seems to arouse in the parents the new idea that they are of some value, and all condescension on her part intended. On the other hand, women also rendered working class children useful, training boys and girls to become better workers and Americanizing immigrants. Next, please. So the desire to construct a foothold in this community didn't stop here. And the renovation of the West Oakland Free Kindergarten was just the first step in a spirited program of institution building on Peralta Street, one in which women continued to count on the spaces of the building to implement their objectives for children, not simply to reflect them. From this grain of a mustard seed, Eva Carlin wrote, in 1900 has grown a good-sized tree, nourished by the personal friendly influence of one woman, and Elizabeth Watt, the president of the charity. Now, there was substance to the biblical metaphors in her text. With Watt in the lead, the free kindergarten, the mustard seed, handily survived the economic depression to become the core of a much bigger, more enduring work. In 1894, Watt hired a settlement worker who carried on her work in the former saloon for about 6 months, and afterwards the kindergarten took over the entire building, and the settlement moved into a cottage, one that Watt rented directly across the street from James Davidson's saloon, and that was this building right here. So next, please. Now, the that was in short order. The free school spawned a larger, more ambitious charity, first called the West Oakland Settlement and later the New Century Club. Watt paid for the renovation and expansion of the settlement and may indeed have commissioned her architect, Julia Morgan, to execute the elegant design that you see here. These two photographs are of the same building. The West Oakland Free Kindergarten is gathered in front of the building, and if you look closely, you can see that Morgan incorporated the massing of the old cottage in what seems to be an entirely new structure. And a few years later, Watt paid for the construction of a new gymnasium. And so this set of drawings documents the incremental construction of this complex, the first location of the settlement house, then the expansion into a larger complex and further, and this elevation was a redo, a kind of recladding and rethinking, I think, of the interior a bit of the building that was once built out of a cottage. Next, please. So the non-sectarian charity also maintained its commitment to racial integration. This club has ever tried to keep free from a spirit of prejudice, Watt wrote in 1901, when many white club women declined to do the same. Children of all races and religions are received into the classes, while the colored woman and her children are made as welcome as those of fairer skin. And you'll notice in the photograph of the sewing school that she's sitting next to an African-American girl, and this is a detail of that photograph. This is also a photo of the free kindergarten. There's McFarland again, and you can see, I think a photo taken at the day the building opened, I'm not sure, but 1906, 1907, around there. And you can see again the racially integrated the social composition of the charity is more or less in direct proportion to the social composition of the neighborhood. Now, Watt gave the complex to the city of Oakland in 1822, a few years before she died, on one condition, that the city open a playground and turn the settlement into a public recreation center. The architectural pattern, and it did do that, the architectural pattern given to this nucleus, a multi-purpose neighborhood recreation center made up of repurposed and purpose-made buildings, had become typical in Oakland. Women who navigated the worlds of social difference to build a charitable landscape for children created an armature that worked as a seed crystal might in another context. They created a physical armature for community building linked with the emerging welfare state. Next, please. And just by way of reminder, at this time, other groups made very different arguments in Northern California. And the Richmond Independent reported that about 750 Klan members joined the Independence Day Parade in 1924 and insisted that they came from San Francisco, Oakland, Vallejo, and San Jose, not from Richmond. And the hope had been, the Klan's hope had been to march in Oakland, but the permission was refused. So next, so the target were immigrants and migrants, people like Arthur Patterson, whom I interviewed in West Oakland. Now, his family left Arkansas in the 1930s and moved to Oakland, part of the Great Migration North. His entire family lived in the back room of the rooming house and saloon that James Davidson had built in the 1880s. And even as a child, the benefits of the urban North were clear to him, although he lived in a racially segregated neighborhood with high rates of poverty and unemployment. So they lived in this room right here, okay, next. And one was this place. Patterson walked across Peralta Street to play at the New Century Recreation Center, and he mourned the loss of this building, the gym, and the playground when the surplus Army tanks scraped the site clean. The facility may have become battered and bruised over the years, but it continued to deliver the promise of a better childhood to children. It demonstrated a child's right to childhood and the sense that a child had become a subject of social solidarity with citizenship rights, and these included the right to play, to learn and play in public places specifically made for a young person. Now, in the heat of the ensuing court battles about the federal taking of the property in the 1960s, the federal government promised to replace the raised center with a new and modern multi-purpose facility. More than 50 years later, that center has not been built. So what are the lessons learned? So I excavated the charitable landscape because it can be judged as a reference for building a just, plural society for children in our own troubled times. History is not just an account of the past, R.J. Mars, the great historian of British social welfare, has argued. It is an account of the relationship between the past and the present. And if this center had survived, it would show that in such a society, the neighborhood is put at the center of community building. An urban fabric pixelated with small-scale works like this one shows that infrastructure means more than transportation, and that children need to be constructed as central actors in building better, more equitable cities and communities. Architects, architectural historians, and children's advocates also need to recognize that repurposing is not simply evidence of adult parsimony, a point I've already made. In Oakland, women insisted that children deserve spaces for childhood. They relied on the spatial practices of repurposing. They started with making minimal and inexpensive physical alterations in everyday settings. They forged constituencies around benefits and built coalitions about the need for change. They understood the importance of networks, nodes, and institutions, and they set in place architectural strategies for investing in childhood that made Oakland into a place for hope about the future rather than only despair about the injustices of the present. Thank you. Any questions? Hi.
Hi. Really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And both which I'll read.
Even better. That's the whole idea.
You mentioned that there were middle-class African Americans
Yes,
who were
right.
involved, but I didn't see them in the leadership that you discussed.
Chapter 9.
Were from that community and that class who were as active as the reformers you talked about?
Yeah, there is, yes, this is African American women are the book deals with the trajectory of race and race's relationship to these charities across the 100-year period. So, and African American women come to the forefront of action after the turn of the 20th century. In the first decade, more so during the First World War, and then the 20s and on. And what they do is I say that, talking about for children, the African American community, which is very small in Oakland and arrives in Oakland largely in relationship to the railroad, expands after the turn of the century. In some measure, well, Oakland becomes one of the bigger Oakland attracts settlement from blacks after the San Francisco earthquake and fire because there's affordable housing and there's room, and there are also buildings. So that, and then as the population of the city grows, the African American presence increases. So what black women first do is they first open women's clubs, and that's in line with as black women do across the United States, and they do so in relationship to the ways in which in response to the ways in which racial segregation fractures the women's club movement in the late 1890s and early 20th century. Now, those women's clubs also start to take the lead in providing charity for children as the charities that I've described become more and more segregated. And they become more and more segregated as the community has more and more black people living in it. And then in the 1920s, the way that the state government starts to regulate orphanages in effect requires that black women, it forces the opening of orphanages for quote unquote colored children as it restricts the access of white children to them. So the landscape becomes segregated according to race as well as to class in ways that are, I think, probably happen in every state, but are rendered very clear in California because of the particular history that we have there. The West Oakland home, which I talked about for a little bit, is in the heart of what will become the center of the African American community, and it takes black children until at least the beginning of the 20th century, at which point it stops. It refuses admission, and and then it builds these new additions, and then it doesn't become fashionable for white children to be in orphanages anymore. It becomes fashionable. Other answers foster care becomes the preferred method. The dormitory's empty, and the charity refuses to take children from the neighborhood. It just won't do it. And so black women rent a building, first rent, and then they actually buy a building which they then name after one of their leaders, called the Fannie Wall Children's Home and Day Nursery, which works as both a day nursery and an orphanage. But the tragedy of this story, the horror of the story, is that there are kids jamming into that building, which is about the size of the building you saw on Peralta Street that became the headquarters of the Black Panther Party, as this huge building around the corner won't take in kids. That orphanage eventually closes, and then the club women raise some money to buy another bigger building, a nicer building in another area, and that building is located on the same block as the day nursery that Irish Catholic nuns opened for white working class kids. And so I have this whole story of how these buildings are back to back in West Oakland, but the kids can't play with one another because it takes. Eventually, St. Vincent's Day Home, which is the only charity to survive all of the urban renewal in West Oakland, becomes a leader in offering progressive integrated daycare in the community. It still operates. It's a great institution. Now, it wasn't a bad institution to begin with. I mean, it reflected the biases of the time. And there's also very strong commitment in the African American community to running autonomous black cultural institutions. So although there is, yes, the demand for integration, I believe, is embraced as a way to win resources that are equal with whites, but not necessarily because actually integration is really all that valued. It's a complicated and interesting story. But yeah, thank you, it's a good question. Earlier in the history, blacks will organize to build old age homes because they can't, they're not allowed into But the story isn't only about the story of segregation in California is not a black-white binary. You know, I mean, in fact, African Americans are more privileged in the 19th century than Asians, who are totally excluded. African Americans will qualify for state subsidies for care in orphanages. Asian children never given. Yeah, hi Nick. Hi, thank you for coming.
I had a question about these international and also domestic networks that were, you were
Right.
pointing out they had this whole community in the
Right.
Bay Area.
And in
also
Ellis.
connecting to the German kindergarten. Could you speak a little bit more about, you said that they were essential in the moment of generating the first house in San Francisco and then again later in the 19th
Right.
century. Do they go away? Is it the same community? Does it evolve? What happens to that network?
Well, just to step back from that question, the ways in which this landscape is built is reflective of the ways in which the understanding of children's needs plays out in pretty much every city in the Western industrial democracies. It starts with orphanages, moves to free kindergartens, and adds settlement houses and playgrounds, and then daycare centers, largely speaking. But it gets all mixed up, because even in the first orphanages you find, and there's an international exchange that happens through conferences, through publications, through personal connections. So they were not inventing the world here. They understood. They were responding to they were reading. These women were reading just like they were doing what was expected, not so what was expected, and also in line with how understandings of childhood and social service for children changed. They were not unique in this way. What Oakland, and I will get to your question in a minute, but what Oakland offers is the ability to understand this set of intertwined networks, because it's a small city and it's new, and also because many of the buildings are built of wood. It reveals certain aspects about the construction of this network that put in evidence the physical side of it, the physical strategies, as well as the social and the institutional ones, which is why it's such a great place to study. So you can find this in New York, you can find it in Chicago, you can find it in London. But what you find in the studies of this kind of work is you find the studies of one kind of building type. So there'll be a trajectory of like one orphanage or one settlement house, but not the trajectory over time, as well as the interconnections that go back and forth. With regard to explicit connections transnationally, with regard, the free kindergarten movement is the best example. Well, the free kindergarten is one example. The settlement house movement would be another example, right? So the specific story there is that Froebel has these ideas, right? He develops these ideas in Germany and Marie, you can talk about this better than I can, because this is your field. But Marie has written does amazing work on children's gardens. Anyway, so. But what Froebel invents the kindergarten. He calls on other people's ideas, but basically he makes it happen in Germany. It's very radical politically, and the kindergartners are forced to leave. They have to leave because they'll otherwise, during the 1848 revolution, otherwise they'll be thrown in prison. So it's basically a German movement in this country. The first kindergartens are German, and they're opened in the Midwest. And you can find this in this is not my research. This is standard stuff in the history of kindergartens, and I can tell you where you can find all those sources, or you can get my book and read it. Anyway, so when Elizabeth Peabody, who is one of the three Peabody sisters in Boston, is the person who brings this to life in Boston, who opens the first American kindergarten, and her sister Mary Peabody Mann married Horace Mann, and then there's the third one. I forget who she is, but they're deeply involved in rethinking education for young children, and in the 1840s and 1850s and 60s. And they think that women, in line with Froebel, that women should teach children, not men, that children should be taught through play, not through reciting Bible text and memorizing alphabets and the like, and that they believe this because they don't believe that the child is inherently sinful. They believe that the child is innocent, and free, and that education should be made in order to make that, to develop that aspect of a child's personality. So a group of people develop around her, including, the one in Southern California, who's Carolyn Severance, who's leader. She's from Boston. She comes to the West Coast. Her husband's a judge or something. They move. He's an attorney. She's a feminist, leader for women's suffrage, a big activist. She comes to California, lives in Los Angeles, sets up a school. Wiggins' family comes to Southern California because her mother's husband has died, and then the second husband died. This is a whole, 19th century crisis. And she has to learn, she has to get a job. She has to learn to teach to support her family. And so she goes to school and she studies with Severance, who has also connected with Emma Marweddel, who was one of Froebel's teachers, who's German and who comes to Southern California. It's this kind of intricate networking that happens, comes to Southern California, and then when the German-based, also German-Jewish-based public kindergarten society is looking for a teacher, they ask Marweddel for advice, and she says, you should hire this great teacher who who's looking for work, who needs to support her family, and bring her to San Francisco. The public kindergarten, to make this even more interesting, is the Public Kindergarten Society formed in San Francisco after Felix Adler, the founder of the Ethical Culture Society in this country, came to San Francisco during the Great Crisis of 1878 and looked at this and said, you have to do something. You just can't sit around and watch class conflict. You've got to take action. And so Germans and German Jews and other progressives formed this kindergarten, and that's how that piece of, it's that intricate a network. It's both specific and contingent on who knew whom and who was studying whom, and also connected to big ideas. Now, the free kindergartens were also kindergartens were also featured in the 1876 exposition in Philadelphia. There was a big exhibit, and Milton Bradley he's a person at this point, not a corporation. He's starting to make the games. Starting to make the toys, to take the toys that Froebel had invented for his kindergarten in Germany and manufacture them, and they sell like wildfire. They're incredibly popular. And there are both charity and non-charity schools. And so the big challenge that people face is, how are you going to convince somebody to pay to teach a child to play, right? And moreover, how are you going to trust Germans to do this, right? So in the 1870s and 1880s, because Germans are not yet American, right? Do we have to go?
You have a lecture for every question.
I do.
I have to ask you. So maybe we could do that while we have some wine.
All right.
Buy a book.
Okay. All right. But you asked. There's no way to answer. I can't answer that. I'm sorry. Was that really boring? I apologize. No. Just one more? Or do we have to stop? Are there any others? Yes. And then we can have wine.
Dare I ask what your opinion is of the universal pre-K that's being adopted and how far it is from the principles that you just...
Well, I think universal pre-K is a wonderful idea. Right. I think what we have is a shadow of what we need. So that's the short answer. See, I can't do a short answer.
Well, there's plenty of time to have a
Okay. Can I take this off?
We'll
You'll with the text. Thank you very much. I wish de Blasio would come to this talk. Or Nick Kristof, or one of those guys. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're in the 21.
All right. Well, those people who are here on time get the special reward of hearing my introduction. I can spread out. So, welcome for those of you who haven't been here before. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder and director of the Skyscraper Museum. And how many people have not been here before? A few. Okay, great. Well, come back. What you maybe don't know, unless you saw it on our website already, that we do monthly an author's talk on a topic that has to do with New York history, skyscrapers, urban history, a whole range of topics. And in this particular season, we had a nice lineup of good friends of long standing rather than old friends. I know Mike Bloomberg would always introduce his commissioners that way.
That's a great way.
So I'm delighted that you can join us, and I would welcome you to come back. Check our website because we're just beginning to line up the spring series, but you're also here, and we invite you to look around towards the beginning of this exhibition, which is called 10 Tops. And it's not a top 10 list, it's a 10 tops list. It's all the buildings in the world that are 100 stories or taller, but not in any particular order, but according to the tops that are most interesting. So at the Skyscraper Museum, we like to take a little bit of a, reverse logic on some things to the normal way of looking at the world. And that's not really a good segue into Marta, but it is to the extent that history was told for a long time in our generation in a particular way. These meta-narratives that shaped the history of architecture, the story of cities. Marta and I and a number of our friends go way back to when we were graduate students, and she was already an architect. To a reading group that we all belonged to, where we would read books and we would discuss them, and then sit down to read books and then sit down to dinner and to continue to discuss them. And so our intellectual shared interests go way, way back. So I knew this book before its birth, really. And speaking of birth, Marta is really born of two disciplines and two parents who represent art history and history. And her father, a noted labor historian, her mother, an art historian. And Marta really marries these two interests in this book, which comes after becoming an architect and practicing as an architect, and then deciding she wanted to go back to school. She graduated from GSAP at Columbia. She decided she wanted to go back to study the history and theory of architecture, and I remember applied to Berkeley. It was accepted in a lot of places, decided to go off to California, which we all resented.
And you haven't heard anything about my mother.
And then spent quite a long time out there on the left coast, and studying within the School of Architecture and Environmental Studies at Berkeley in history. And so born of those people and those disciplines, and her own interest in looking at history differently than our generation of historians did, is this study, and the title of the book is City for Children, Women, Architecture, and the Charitable Landscape of Oakland. For 100 years, 1850 to 1950. And it's a book that is revisionist in many ways, but most particularly in the topic of looking at the city through these institutional dimensions, but not big monumental institutions, small-scale ones.
See, this is what makes us such good friends, is we do the same thing.
So I have the big
You're the big ones,
yeah.
right, but we look at...
So in any case, it's a delight after hearing all of these years of this book being in process to hear about it now with at least a year or two's worth of distance from the actual publication of the book, and lots of praise and awards for this effort. So let's welcome Marta here. What she has to say.
Thank you.